Whenever you think I should start.
Oh, I think we can go. I don't know if I have to introduce you and Dan, but Hans Peter and Dan are from the. It's not on the screen, but university in New Norfolk. I don't know what I had Newport in mind, but Norfolk and Old Dominion. That was I wanted to say, and this session is really a follow-up of the previous one, but more on what kind, once the platform is on, what kind of action should we have, and consequently best practices to use this platform, which is yet to come. So the floor is yours, and Peter.
Okay. So what we would like to do here is really to pick up on several of the sessions that we had, which looked at what we already are providing and how we can provide what we have a little bit better. We also, in some of the sessions, we discussed, for example, ethical aspects of what we are doing. And I think what very often is not discussed sufficiently, in my opinion, is what motivates us in doing a certain research, in creating a certain knowledge, and the question what data and knowledge are actually needed if we have a certain aim. And then we talk since at least 15 to 20 years about co-creation of research agendas and co-creation of knowledge. We talk about co-usage of knowledge, and that is something that this session is going to focus on. And we have 3 points, and we will not have very long presentations. I will introduce each of those points very briefly, and then we will go into a discussion. So the first point is what data and knowledge are needed. And here the focus in the discussion should be really on the best practices that we need to do a gap analysis, to do an identification and a prioritization of knowledge. And that includes, for example, as was mentioned in the earlier session today, life cycle analysis and understanding what is the impact of certain things that happen in society. And then we will go into the co-creation of research agendas and knowledge. Who actually determines the research agenda? Is this something that we do, we scientists, we researchers, because we are interested in something, or is this something that comes from society? So what are the best practices in engaging stakeholders in the development of research agendas and the co-creation of knowledge? And then a point that is very important to myself is, can we leave the knowledge once it is created and then hope that some societal agents pick it up and use it? Or should we, those who have helped in creating the knowledge or have been leading the creation of knowledge, should we get involved in the use of the knowledge and assist societal agents in using our knowledge? And what would be the best practices for this? So I would like to first introduce this point, and then we will have a discussion, 30 minutes about this point. A few things. My focus, and I think maybe that should be today a focus, is addressing the Anthropocene risks. And marine debris is definitely one of those risks that are created as a result of the Anthropocene. And those risks are normally interconnected with many other aspects. And this sketch down here that Claude Garcia showed at one of the workshops that we organized in Brest is basically showing that we have an understanding of the past. We have an idea of what future we would want to see or what future might happen. And we are in this kind of bottleneck that we need to make management decisions that lead us to the future that is acceptable and desirable. And these management processes need to be informed by knowledge, both about the past and about the possible futures. And then, of course, when we look at all these different futures that might happen, the question is, can we help society to understand the spectrum of possible futures and even those archetypes of the futures that might be desirable, might not be desirable? The problem that we have to understand is, what are our assumptions about knowledge needs? And that guide our gap analysis and our prioritization of knowledge. And in the time that we are having today of emerging Anthropocene risks, and most of those Anthropocene risks are actually global catastrophic risks, the question is, can we continue at what we have done in the past, where we have focused on avoiding type 1 errors? We didn't want to give false alarms. We didn't want to be accused of having discovered something that then turned out not to be happening, not to be true. Or do we need to focus now more on type 2 errors? And that means not overlooking warning signs and really understanding what might be happening in the future and might be very undesirable. And a good example is, of course, what we are talking about here in this workshop, marine debris and plastic. We have a very good understanding, and that was mentioned earlier today, Renee pointed it out, that we have a good understanding of how much is being produced, despite the fact that those numbers are a little bit uncertain. I would say the uncertainty is at least 10% in these numbers. We know what it is used for. We know what the side effects are. We know the lifetimes of plastic to some extent. And so when we look at the future, we can say that if the 2% annual increase that we had in the past continues, then by 2045, we will be producing more than 800 million tons a year. And the total production will have reached 26 billion tons of plastic. And if only 1% of that goes into the ocean, then we have already 260 million tons of plastic in the ocean. And I think we also need to worry about that in the coastal built environment with the development that we are seeing and the usage of plastic. We will have something like 1.7 billion tons built into the built environment of the urban coast, and that is waiting for hurricanes, storm surges, tsunamis, and other ways, eventually going into the ocean. Not in the next 10 years or so, but eventually a lot of this could go into the ocean. And that means that plastic that we put into the planetary physiology may impact between 500 billion and 1 trillion people who might be born over the next 5,000 years. And so the question that I think we need to ask when we talk about knowledge needs, is this plastic crisis actually violating the rights of those not yet born? And does science have an ethical obligation to create the knowledge that society needs to assess and address these risks? And that brings me to almost to the end. When we look at sustainability science is trying to create the transformation knowledge that leads us from the current system state to the goals we have. For example, we are working a lot on the transformation knowledge needed to make progress towards the Sustainable Development Goals. And we also need to think about the monitoring and the supporting of the interventions that society is making to reach the Sustainable Development Goals or other goals, and to monitor the impacts of those interventions and to develop corrections if needed. So knowledge needs that comes from that. And then we have done a lot, for example, in the group on Earth observations, to enable gap analyses. This is an example from the user requirement registry of GEOS, where the gap analysis was done by a comparison of requirements for observations and products available, and then a prioritization. We did a project in Europe where we looked at all the different ways people are doing gap analyses. We identified that the characterization of gaps was very different in the different groups. The Science and Technology Committee of GEO did something different from Connecting GEO, the project I was involved in, and Gaia Clim, another project, came up with others. We identified a methodology, but there was no consensus on what is the best practice of doing a gap analysis. And when we go to a goal-based gap analysis, for example, where we start with a societal challenge, we establish some goals. It could be, for example, the goals to stay within the global boundaries of the safe operating space for humanity, or to reach the Sustainable Development Goals or other goals. we can go down this line here to come to observation specifications and then use a kind of a marketplace approach to identify what is actually needed in society and what is available. Prioritization of gaps is then another problem that we have. And this is an example from the Gaia Clim project where they wanted to use the question whether it is a measurable outcome, it's achievable, it has relevance for the users, it is an action that can be implemented in a certain time. In the user requirement registry, we try to utilize the graph data linking requirements and applications in society and coming up with a parameter. And in connecting geo, we came up with different gaps, and we said maybe the feasibility and impact versus cost and time needed to actually address the gap helps us to prioritize the gaps. So what I'm showing you is there's a wide diversity of what people think and what people have been doing, but I have not seen that gap analysis actually have an impact, a measurable impact on research agendas and on efforts to close those gaps. So for the discussion, I would like to hear from you. What approaches are there for gap analysis and knowledge need prioritization? Do we have best practices, or do we even have practices in a way? And how can we actually decide on what is best? How can we actually decide if you do a gap analysis in this way, then funding agencies, for example, should listen to you. Policymakers should be listening to you. How can we get in kind of an authority to the outcome of gap analysis? Okay, I'm waiting for people who want to contribute.
And you can use the chat as well.
Yeah. I don't see anything in the chat.
Nope.
Hi, may I?
Yeah, of course.
Thank you for the opportunity to discuss this aspect, especially to understand the gaps. And it's important to figure out that when we talk about gaps, we have gaps for different issues and for different scenarios. So we are talking about data. We are talking about information on marine litter to understand the trends, to identify hotspots, to evaluate the efficiency of public policies, for example. So it's when we discuss that, it's really important to have in mind what are the goals, what are we intending to have. For example, we are having a discussion here in São Paulo State in Brazil to create a state plan on monitoring and assessment of marine litter. And then the idea is to have a list of indicators that can be generated by the government or by partners, so that we will understand the problem, the issue of marine litter. And then how we did that? We started using policy concerns, the policy concerns that were cited, that were provided by the Gazette report on the guidelines for monitoring and assessment of marine litter. And then we used that as a anchoring point, okay, to guide the discussion, so that the discussion will not be loose, will not be uncontrolled. And then we started to think what kind of information, what kind of indicator would be relevant to address the policy concern of human health related to marine litter. And then we started to organize the ideas in a way that the indicators would be formally and directly linked to a policy concern. And then this was a very good approach. We evaluated this with the stakeholders that participated into the process. And it was very, very good to have this kind of guideline or goal in mind to identify the gaps. It's only to share some of the lessons learned here in the process we are conducting.
Okay, thank you. You know what, if I can ask, since nobody else is speaking, I can ask you, to what extent are you focusing on what is the crucial information that is needed in society to trigger action? You know, this morning, for example, we talked a lot about mass balance. And the question is, how accurate do we actually need the mass balance so that society can react to it and understand the risk? Are we trying to, for example, estimate the risk for the marine biosphere that we are creating, and what this risk for the marine biosphere would mean back for the risk of, for example, food security, health issues in humanity? And are we focusing on this knowledge that may trigger a reaction in society, or are we trying to get with the highest accuracy a mass balance, maybe with an accuracy nobody in society even cares about, because it's not what they use as an information to or a knowledge to plan actions? So that's the challenge that I see. You know, do we know what would actually trigger actions in society?
Yeah, no, we are not in that phase. The next step will be the creation, the elaboration of the plan to combat marine litter, and then this kind of information will be crucial, so that among the indicators we are developing, we will have the opportunity to identify which ones would be more informative in terms of guiding the actions. For example, we may here in Brazil face the informal livelihoods, which is not the case of the global north. In the global south, informal livelihoods are very common, and this is a very important source of marine litter. So perhaps here it would be very important to have information, specific indicators on the occurrence of informal livelihoods, so that we can combat it. And then combating it, we can combat the leaching of plastics to the ocean. So it's a kind of information that we don't have in hands, but we are mapping it as an important indicator that should be provided to guide the combat of marine litter. I'm not sure if I am answering appropriately your question, but this is an example of what we are facing here in terms of gaps of information to tackle marine litter.
Okay. Anybody else?
From the citizen science perspective, it's interesting because there are always different pathways to input, but there's not always clarity about what those pathways are. So my organization, in the context of biodiversity and environmental monitoring, has commissioned legal analysis to understand the degree that the Endangered Species Act, for example, includes provisions for citizen input. But if you're looking at plastics, you have to consider the role of international policy assessments like the SDGs, national level legislation, in some cases regional or state policies, and then often municipal policies as well, because the information and the pathways that it would take to get a single-use plastic ban on the municipal level, or to work with municipal governments to better allocate resources for waste management and recycling, that's not number of pieces of plastics per square kilometer. And that's what the UN needs. So I think it's important to have knowledge of the different pathways to both scientific and policy input, and then also translate those to a wide range of stakeholders.
Yeah, you see what you said is actually something that was considered in this bottom part here. We had two approaches that were top-down One was the goal-based approach, where we took societal goals like the Sustainable Development Goals and looked at what are the knowledge gaps. And the other one was we looked at international programs and international conventions to look at what are the knowledge needs that they have and compared them to what is available. And then we also looked at the bottom-up processes. And one is, for example, what expert-based communities do to identify essential variables and then come up with ideas that these essential variables need to be monitored. And you can look at, are the data available that we need for the essential variables? And then there was also a search in literature, a search in the web. NASA, for example, funded a big gap analysis by looking at words, keywords that were mentioned in scientific publications. And if words were mentioned very often, then they had a high priority. It was a kind of a weird outcome. For example, sea level was only mentioned in 2 or 3 publications they looked at. So sea level had a very low priority, despite the fact that society may have a very different opinion about that. And we also looked at bottom up from the industry challenges. What are industry working on? The different industries, and do they have knowledge needs that are not being met? So we looked at all of those different things, and citizen science or getting involved in citizen science projects is definitely one way. And we will come back to that when we talk about the co-creation. So the point that we need to discuss here is, can we come up with something that gives gap analysis a little bit more authority? And that's something that I think is a very important discussion needed in respect to the ocean best practice system.
Oh, and Peter, yesterday I showed a table taken out of a paper from Thomas Maes. I think he's in the participant list, showing kind of also a let's say categorization of the different for marine leader, the different subpart like monitoring or modeling, or category 10 or 12 category, and according to not what was written in the literature, but the kind of projects which were sent by replying to a call for project from the European Union. Thomas, I don't know if you want to comment that. I don't have it handy to show it on the screen, but if I can find it back, but if you're online, it's a possibility for you to comment that, because that's also a possibility to find a gap analysis that or to, let's say, okay, Thomas, it's your paper.
Yeah, probably my connection is really bad because I've got my wife and my children on Netflix as well, so I don't know if you can hear me.
Okay.
Try again.
Okay, he said he will write it in the chat instead of talking.
Okay, yeah, I see that. Yeah, okay, good.
Okay. The Connecting Geo project, for example, in the end, we had something like 200 gaps identified. We prioritized them. We wrote a report to the European Union and to the European Commission. And the question is, to what extent was their authority associated with what we did? And could we have done a better job if there would have been a kind of a best practice approach and a way of validating the approach? That's the question that I think we need to address a little bit more. in the frame of this ocean best practices registry. I'm, for example, not aware whether in OBPS there's actually an algorithm or a process, an approach to say, okay, if this is the process we need to go through so that we come up with an idea of a best practice, an agreed upon best practice. If you remember IGOSP, the International Global Observing Strategy Partnership, had a process in which we went through a long process to accept the document that would identify observation needs and knowledge needs. I don't think we have this right now, that we actually have a process where a group can make a proposal and say, okay, we would like to develop a best practice for this area, where we, for example, as a marine litter and marine debris working group could come up and say, we would like to do that. And then there would be a process of authorizing or accepting this in the end as the best practice of determining knowledge needs.
Yeah, I was following at the same time the chat, and you see that at the start, Thomas is saying that an expert group defining the upper level, and Alex is also giving an example of how to co-construct, but there is always a group in the beginning, and we have to hope that the experts do not miss anything. That's the main point. And so, yes, exactly. Thomas is saying that nothing much has changed over the last 10 years. So same gaps and a focus on monitoring. So maybe we need to, I don't know how and where, but in the expert groups include maybe non-technically oriented people, or people knowledge of the technicalities, but also of some other fields, like you said in the beginning, ethics and things like that. So that's the only reach that we can have is to have a larger representation of all the aspects. If not, of course, if you have only monitoring people in the expert group, then the main topic is monitoring.
Yeah.
So, you know,
May I?
Sure.
Okay. Go ahead.
No, that's the point. That's the point. In this process, we are facilitating here in São Paulo State. We mapped about 400 stakeholders that produce or may produce data on marine litter, from the sources to the sinks, to the impacts and effects. And then we selected those, about 100, from NGOs, from private sector, from the government, both state and municipal government, and also different governmental agencies like water management agencies, marine protected areas, and several initiatives, and also from universities. And then this process was conducted together with the state agency that would be in charge of organizing and sharing the data. So the State Environmental Agency, so that the process is owned by all these stakeholders and is owned by the state government, which created a state waste management plan, including a chapter. It's being done right now, included a chapter on marine litter, which incorporates the need to have a plan to monitor and assess marine litter. So that this is really important, to include the stakeholders that will feed and that will own the process, so that it will have a long-term, a long life, okay? And then this is being very very fruitful here, because we have some kind of we are securing that the process will take longer and will not rely only on the duration of a scientific project. Okay, because the relevant stakeholders are co-creating the process, not are only being consulted or so. This is important to consider.
Yes, thank you. I think that, you know, these are all very important points. I sometimes have the impression that we are focusing very strongly, because that's our field of expertise, on the observation, the data that is needed, and not so much on the knowledge that can come out of the data. And the usable knowledge is something that we are even less talking about. Just an example, the European Commission is, I think, in the process of discussing a directive towards a circular economy. And when you know, a circular economy would have a very big impact on marine debris, and the potential of reducing the numbers that I showed a little bit earlier that might accumulate over the next 30, 40 years in the ocean. So are we, for example, looking at what knowledge do they need to actually determine what a circular economy really means and what it should mean, and what leakages are acceptable and out of the circular processes? There will always be leakages. And the question is, where are the most important ones? Do we have the knowledge? Can we give that to society? Or are we more interested in just monitoring the progress? This was something with the Sustainable Development Goals, where our community was focusing immediately on the indicators and not on the transformation knowledge that is needed to actually make progress towards the Sustainable Development Goals. There's currently a Belmont Forum call open for pathways to sustainability, where they say you have to look at least 3 Sustainable Development Goals and see the interconnections and come up with knowledge about how we could make progress towards this. This is something that we as an observing community have not very strongly focused on. We are focusing on the monitoring of progress. And so the question that I always ask is really going back to you know, do we have an understanding of not what data is needed, but what knowledge is needed in society to make decisions towards more sustainability? And Alex, what you wrote about incorporating the relevant actors in a societal learning process, this is exactly what we are going to discuss in the next point. So it seems like that there is, from the chats that I see, there is a kind of an agreement that this understanding of knowledge needs and identifying of knowledge gaps requires that we somehow include society in the process. And maybe we can go a little bit earlier than planned to the next point on the agenda, and see whether we need more time for those points. So if there's no more contribution to this idea or this question about the best practice for gap analysis, identifying of knowledge needs, and prioritizing of knowledge needs.
Just a comment. Just a comment. Capturing what Ann Bowser said about it should be goal oriented, to not only incorporate the stakeholders but also consider a goal-oriented process. I think it's very important to consider, as Anne mentioned.
Yes, and I think that was also one of the conclusions we came up with in the Connecting Geo project, and we wrote a publication about that. You know, that we really need a goal-based approach to knowledge need identification and gap analysis, and we developed actually a kind of a formal process for that, but it didn't turn into a best practice. So that would be the next step. But let's go to the next point. I have only 2 or 3 slides to introduce the next point, and that's really the co-creation of research agendas and knowledge And there was a lot of discussion about that after the 2002 Summit on Sustainable Development. And so the question again is, do we have best practices here? And one of the things that I want to make as a particular point here is that if we have the goal to create knowledge that's used by societal agents, then we have to look at what is actually defined as knowledge. And one of the things that is being accepted as epistemology as a way of defining knowledge is to say that a statement is knowledge if it is justified, true, and believed. That's something that goes back to Plato, and today we know, of course, that we need a fourth condition to actually be sure that it is knowledge. But let's focus on just these. And the one thing that we are focusing on as scientists is to justify the statement and to make sure the statement is true. And then we publish it in the scientific literature, and we don't care whether anybody in society, well, maybe we care, but we don't make an effort whether anybody in society believes it and uses it. So the focus on believed, because if we have knowledge as scientists, as researchers, that society doesn't believe, then it's not going to impact any societal actions. We have to make sure that somehow the societal agents believe what our statements are, and that requires trust in knowledge creation. If there is no trust in society in the knowledge we are creating, they will not accept it as knowledge. And that this is something that has been discussed quite a lot after 2002 in a number of publications. And it became very clear that the traditional way, which is the closer to the origin of the coordinate system here, is knowledge driven. The participation of users is very low. And the result that they come up with these publications is that the more you go to a problem driven and a participatory approach to knowledge creation, the more use of knowledge will take place in society. And so if we are really interested in creating knowledge, not just for us, that we have as knowledge, but also that society has as knowledge, we need to come to a different mode of knowledge creation. Kershaw et al. Say that it's post-normal, and Mauser et al. Are also saying that it has to be integrated far more than it is today. And Mauser also came up with a kind of a process for that, where they have different steps in how you actually involve the societal agents. And we have over the past experimented a lot with different ways of doing this. The corner that I'm personally very interested in is the lower left part of this diagram, where we have companion model, participatory learning and action, participatory planning, where it is more focused on knowledge sharing than necessarily creating new knowledge. And I think that's something that we should be probably thinking about what would be best practices in actually engaging societal agents, and not just engaging them with what we are doing, but our engaging with them, what they are doing, and creating, while participating in their activities, the knowledge they actually need. So again, what approaches to co-creation of research agenda and co-creation of knowledge do we have? I showed a diagram with a lot of different approaches. What are the practices for that? And can we actually decide on what is the best? And again, I hope that we get a lively discussion.
Hi, may I contribute?
Of course.
Hi, my name is Carla. I work with Professor Turra in this program that he was mentioning with the statewide plan for São Paulo in Brazil. And this goes really well with the framework that we've been working with. So the idea of co-creation is definitely something that we had from the start of the project. So one of the lessons learned, I'd say, that we had with our co-creation of the plan was the need for time, patience, and really creating and then deconstructing, then constructing again, going back and really building something that is participatory with all the stakeholders involved. So this goes back also to one point that was raised, I think it was on Monday or Tuesday, on the issue of, do managers know what to ask, in fact, when we're talking about the science behind marine litter? So how well have we been informing people about the knowledge that we have, or the knowledge that can be generated from the data that we keep telling them is so important to be collected? So this is something that in the plan that we're working in São Paulo, we really dedicated a lot of time to create a common knowledge, a baseline of to work on, so that people would understand how this can all be connected. So we worked with 3 groups of indicators, considering the generation of litter, the exposure to litter, and the effects of litter in different compartments in the environment. So this involves stakeholders from the public sector, from private sector, universities, and all kinds of people really, and trying to engage also citizen scientists. So this is has been a really big effort, but it takes a lot of time. I'd say this is maybe one of the biggest lessons learned, is that it's not an easy process, but it's definitely necessary.
Yeah, and you see, if we are interested in solving societal problems, or in contributing to the solution of societal problems, or an improvement of the situation, is much better to say than solution, because most of those problems are what social planners call wicked problems, and they don't have a solution. They have only a possibility to improve the situation or to make it worse. And that really requires that we understand the nature of wicked problems much better, and that involves a very tedious process. It involves a participatory process. Normally it has to be transdisciplinary because it's problem focused. And as you said, it's very tedious. We have developed here at Old Dominion a program in conservation and sustainability leadership, where all the students who go through this program have to do 3 case studies in sustainability, and all of those case studies are wicked problems, and they all involve participatory approaches, and it's very tedious. It's really difficult if you want to solve what these problems are. And on the other hand, we don't have really, and that's what the 2 papers are clearly saying that I showed you earlier, Kirschau et al. And Mauser et al. They say we don't have the practice, the process for a successful participation of the stakeholders in the creation of the knowledge. We are experimenting, but we have not really found what is a very good way of getting the stakeholders involved.
Yes, and I think there's also the factor of local realities being different. So the lessons learned in one place do not necessarily completely reflect what's going to happen in another place, and different leaderships that you have in different sectors. So for example, we've been very privileged to having such good partners in the state, in the public sector, working on the plan with us. If we didn't have such willing individuals within the organization, maybe this wouldn't have gone forward. So sometimes the participatory process is also dependent. It relies on individual leaderships, which is maybe harder to harvest or to recognize within a group. How do you know that a specific partner that you're engaging with will be this leader in the process that you're co-creating? So maybe sometimes it won't work out, and it's just something that we'll have to find pathways on how to deal with it. So best practices on plan A and plan B, plan C, and things like that.
Yeah, I think you made a very important point here, because one of the 10 criteria for a wicked problem that were listed in the original publication by Riddle and Weber a long time ago, is that wicked problems are unique. And so very often the example of poverty is being used. If you address poverty in Texas, it may look similar to poverty in Bangladesh, but the solution or the interventions you can make in Texas are very different from the interventions you can make in Bangladesh to address poverty. And so we have to understand that we have to really be involved in the problem if we want to co-create knowledge that can be used to improve the situation. And the other thing is that they don't have a stopping rule, those wicked problems. You are never done. And so you can't, as a scientist, come in, solve the problem, and walk away. So we have to be willing to actually be continuously involved in the knowledge creation and in the implementation of options. And then we get a new problem that we need to look at. I think that's what you were also indicating in what you were saying.
Yes, definitely. I see that Tuha also complementing here what I was mentioning here, and the idea of bottom-up facilitated approaches are important, respecting the timing of stakeholders. So definitely focus on the qualification process and not necessarily on the outcomes. So it's a process like you mentioned as well, Hans-Peter, that you can't step away from it when as if the project has been concluded successfully. It will never be concluded. It will be ongoing successfully, and you'll have maybe indicators to show success, and you'll be able to monitor that kind of process. But it's not something that you can open and then close.
Yeah. And what we often overlook is that a subgroup of those wicked problems are called super wicked problems, and they have the additional, one of the 4 additional criteria is that those who cause a problem try to solve it. And we have to be very careful as scientists that if we are involved in the problem, that the things that we create as knowledge is not impacted by our own personal biases in relation to the problem. So we have to be very careful when we try to come up with solutions that in the end might not be very comfortable for us personally. But separating this personal situation, the personal perspective on the problem, as a person who is part in creating the problem, is a very difficult step for us in co-creation of knowledge.
Definitely. And I think with the issue of marine litter, it's so transversal. You mentioned the SDGs, and they touch on every single one of them, if you think about it. So it's a matter of involving stakeholders that might even be unlikely groups of stakeholders that you did not imagine could be part of the solution or the co-creation of the process. So it goes from people, like I mentioned, the public sector, maybe working with circular economy, but it also goes to the fishermen and people who simply enjoy the beach and have other kinds of relationships with the ocean. And that also connects with ocean literacy and the whole concept of the influence people have on the ocean and the ocean have on individuals. Yeah. So it's definitely a wicked problem. It's very complex and transversal.
Well, I would like to give others a chance to talk.
Yes, definitely.
But no, I mean, I wanted to say something, but I'll wait. I also said something. The point I wanted to make, since nobody else is speaking, is that in these case studies of sustainability problems that my students do, we have done by now at least 80, maybe 90 case studies, some in groups, some in individual, doing this. Most of them are in the real world during internships. It becomes clear that mapping the stakeholders in terms of who is impacted, who is interested, who might contribute and might have the authority to contribute to the solution is very difficult for most of our science students, because it's clear that they actually don't really understand how society works and who is impacted and who has authority to do something. And it's a very big step for them to actually map the stakeholders that are connected with a wicked problem. And even more difficult for them is to map the rules and regulations that apply that need to be changed or that need to be modified, or maybe even new ones need to be put up. And very often they have a very naive view on how regulations in society actually work and impact a solution. And I think that's also true. Probably that would also be true if we go to scientists actually working in society. Very often we are not the best in understanding who are stakeholders of a problem and who are in a situation to actually do something about a problem. Would you agree? Or does anybody want to comment on that? Well, I think we might have a shorter discussion session than the 2 hours allocated to us. It seems like the contributions are a little bit limited to a few speakers.
I think it's just a really big problem. I think everybody's here because they're interested in thinking about it and talking about it. But in terms of concrete contributions, you know, these are huge questions, not just for plastic, but kind of for the world and for science and society, definitely.
Mm-hmm. Well, you know, would you agree with me that maybe we are focusing too much on what we can do and which is natural for human beings, right? We like to get confirmation about what we are doing, how great it is, and how nice it is, and it gives us pleasure. And we are not really fully accepting that we may be in a situation that is, I sometimes compare traditional science to a practitioner, a doctor who is a practitioner who has most of the time to do with healthy people who are a little bit concerned that they might have a little thing, to a doctor who works in the emergency room. And if you work in the emergency room, you are not doing what you like to do, you do what is necessary to keep the patient alive.
So I would even add another dimension to that, which is working in the emergency room during COVID-19, which is a time of acute crisis when a lot of traditional regulations are relaxed by necessity. And I think we're nearing that phase here.
Are we accepting that we might be heading for a kind of an emergency for the planet?
I mean, it's interesting to me that 1411 was one of the only indicators that, you know, it's a 2025 goal, it's not a 2030 goal. And that is a huge statement to the urgency. I think this and climate are two that are really urgent, just from my perspective. And I know I'm one of those people who talk more, so I'll stop talking now.
Yeah, Gilbert, you raised the hand.
Actually, I find the discussion on co-creation very deep, and it makes people to think deeply. One thing I can say is in terms of knowledge, you know, like when we are going to stakeholders, sometimes also the way we frame the knowledge, the way we frame the goal, it's very important that you frame it in such a way that you give room for the stakeholders or for the community to come up with their ideas. And sometimes the way we frame the knowledge, it's in a way that, or the goal is, it becomes a close-ended kind of goal, whereby by that point, as much as we bring the community in, the goal itself already it's closed in quotes. So I think having that participatory approach whereby you frame the goal from the beginning in a way that it brings the community in can also go a long way in them participating fully.
Mm-hmm. Okay. Yeah, well, I think that I agree that these are deep questions. I also think that these deep questions need to be discussed. And I have been, for example, involved since 2003 with GEO, and I have made very often the comment that I thought there was a lack of urgency. We were looking at, the data that is interesting to collect and to make available, but there was not really necessarily a very strong focus, at least in the first 10 years, on the very urgent problems. And I think we need to assess the situation that we are facing in this planet, on this planet, a little bit, and have this impact our role in which we engage in the co-creation of research agendas and knowledge. Well, is there anyone else who would like to continue this discussion about point 2 before we go to point 3? Well, I'll go back to the slide presentations, and the last point that we have here on the agenda is the co-usage of knowledge. And that's really the question of the best practice for the delivery of knowledge to the decision and policymakers, and for our engagement with policymaking, including the ethical considerations that come with that. And again, I would like to show this diagram here, the different ways we have. And now the emphasis is on not engaging the societal agents with what we are doing, but to engage with the societal agents in what they are doing. And I think that's, there's a whole set of things. And I'm not sure which of those activities are the best ones. Definitely when we look at the lower right corner, the science, the expert panels is something that very often is important and might help when we have a new problem. The United States, for example, established an expert panel for how to handle COVID, which was not considered by many people a very big success. But it is a way of engaging, but are there other ways of engaging? And when we look again at the Mauser publication, they referred to a need that we need new pathways to sustainable development and using the knowledge for these pathways. And I think that's the basis also of the Belmont Forum call that is open currently for pathways to sustainable development. We have been, in my group here, we have been thinking about ways of integrating science into society. So it's no longer science from the outside supporting society, but science need to be integrated in society. And at a workshop several years ago, we came up with this idea: we need a kind of a virtual stakeholder table where all the stakeholders can sit at a table and have discussions and deliberations with the experts that are integrated in society, and not something here is science and there is society. And currently, and I talked about this a little bit in the citizen science session, currently we are thinking about how a virtual community center can be a pathway of integrating science and society in society, with the experts actually being present, and with the goal to increase scientific literacy and information and risk and sustainability literacy. So these are ideas, and I would like to hear from you where you see is the main pathway of getting knowledge to actually being used in society. Is this where we are the experts on the outside, or should we actually be part of the stakeholder group that is trying to address a problem? Again, what ways do we have as experts and as researchers to support the societal use of knowledge? And do we have practices and best practices for that? And how can we actually decide on what is best? So this how can we decide on what is best question applies to all 3 points. And I still don't think we have made a lot of progress in this direction, that we have a process of deciding on what is best, what is the best practice. Okay. I'm not sure why I'm always drawn to the deep questions, but for me, the deep questions are the ones that are most exciting. But
Hi, Hans-Peter.
yeah.
Not intending to concentrate the mic here, but I think these are very important questions that you are bringing, and these questions talk about the process and talk about engaging people, talk about creating the momentum where the actions will take part. And then, as you asked it here, I think, as in the subglobal assessment network, we discussed a lot this, because we were groups of scientists and practitioners not linked to the decision makers. And then we always asked why our recommendations are not being considered by decision makers. It's easy, because decision makers are not taking part of the discussion and the creation of the solutions. So we need to engage them, because we do not have the mandate to solve the problems. We have the mandate to inform the process and to have a critical view, for example, and then the decisions will be taken by decision makers. So in my opinion, that's the point. If they are not involved in the process, or if they are not interested in having a process to solve this problem, the information will be very difficult to be considered by them. One example is the fire, the wood fires, the forest fires here in Brazil. We have very good information from our space agency, from NASA from the European Space Agency, and all this information is not considered because the government is not intending to solve the problem. It's not being so that if we need to be part of a group with stakeholders, with decision makers, so that they will want to do that actions, and we will do that with the best available knowledge that we and other stakeholders will be able to provide. So that's my thoughts on that.
Yeah, thank you very much. I think that's a very important point. And before I comment on that, Thais, you want to say something?
Yes. I was having a discussion with mostly with Carla and here in the comments about the urgency that Anne mentioned before, that we are our goal, the goals are to 2025, not 2030, as most goals are. So we have this urgency, this feeling of we have to do things now. We have to collect data now. We do, of course, but I feel that if this urgency, this almost a panic, we get to collecting and immediately, and later we only discuss how this data can be used, what we really want to do with it, how we check on quality, as we were discussing in the previous sessions in this week. And Carla said that maybe not maybe, but we also should be thinking how we generate knowledge now, because what we really need is knowledge. And I feel that this urgency really affects how we create knowledge and prepare ourselves for the decisions we need help to make.
Yes, and you see, this is the point that I tried to make in the beginning. Knowledge is only, a statement is only knowledge if it is believed. If nobody believes the statement, it's not knowledge. And so we have to communicate the statements we create as true and justified in a way that they can be believed, and they can only be believed if there is trust in the way the statements were created. And that requires participation of those who are supposed to, in the end, accept the knowledge and use it in the creation process. And the question is participatory modeling, for example, a good way of doing that, achieving this? Do we need to actually develop participatory modeling more as a general practice that we do?
Yes, yeah, and I think that also we need to do the participatory modeling. You need participatory creation, but what I mean, we need to do a process that usually takes time, because participation and trust usually take a lot of time. We are trying to speed up a process that usually takes a lot of time. That's why that's not the only reason, but that's one of the reasons these discussions are so difficult. And I think it's also one of the reasons why when you propose a question, for example, right now in the session, we all take a lot of time to think and process, because we are constantly trying to get solutions and get things going, but that we have this like the influx of ideas that we may have not given proper thought all the time. I may be speaking this because I'm really because I'm younger and I'm kind of new to this field, and this is what I feel, but I don't know. It really feels like this. It feels like we have too many ideas because we need to rush processes that are really slow. Trust is slow. Participation, particularly in creating things from ground up, from bottom up, is slow. So it's a slow process. So creating all this in like 10, because this is an ongoing process from 10 years from now, maybe 20 years from now, to 4 or 5 years into the future. It's a very fast process. So this is what I feel. This is a good gut feeling that Renee said.
Okay.
Yeah, for Hans-Peter and I, future is in 20 years is going to be behind us.
This is the advantage when the expiration date is very close. Then you don't have to worry so much about shelf time anymore. But if you are young, and my students are all young, you know, they have a different situation. And I would like to make one point here, and hopefully this will trigger a lot of discussion. And that's a question of urgency. Mm. Are we actually aware of the warning signs? So 2 weeks ago, I got into my car, which is 17 years old. I turned on the car and it made a noise, right? Warning sign. There was a noise, an unknown noise. Well, I said, well, maybe, hopefully it's not something I need to worry about. So I drove, and then a yellow light came on. And I said, okay, it's yellow, it's not red. And Toyota has told me that I don't have to worry about the yellow lights. And then another yellow light came on. And then I made a decision, should I now stop my car and get a tow truck to get it to the car dealer? Or should I just go to the car dealer? And of course, on the way to the car dealer, other yellow lights came on, and then the car stopped and broke down in a very unpleasant situation, right? I didn't listen to the warning signs. I didn't see that the collapse was not when the car stopped. The collapse was starting when the noise came. And maybe because of this experience, but a few days ago, I had a dream where I realized that we are, you know, people are talking about the coming collapse of the biosphere, the climate. And the dream told me we are in the collapse. It's not the end of the collapse. We are in the middle of the collapse and we are not seeing it. So is the urgency not much larger than we actually want to admit? Do we have a blind spot? in when we look at the planet. And are we as scientists not doing a good job in informing society about what's going on? So that would be a point that I think using the knowledge, creating the knowledge, and making sure that society understands what is happening with patient Earth and us integrated in this system. Anyone who wants to react to this hopefully provocative thought that we have blind spots like I had in my car?
I think that was a very good analogy, and I completely agree as well that we are in a blind spot and that we are in the collapse. We are living it now. I feel that we have a movement that's going on now with much more environmental awareness among not just younger people, but older people are also more aware, even if superficially. So if you go to a supermarket, for example, and you say you don't want a plastic bag, people will automatically go like, oh yeah, Mother Nature thanks you for not using a plastic bag, or something very generic and superficial. Doesn't mean that they actually know the problem that the plastic bag represents, and they themselves have a very let's say, eco-friendly way of life and things like that. But people understand the symbols that we've introduced as environmentalists and as scientists, not just with plastic pollution, for example, with climate change as well. This is something that we can definitely learn lessons on about the crisis that we're living. So we have a marine litter crisis going on, and we don't necessarily treat it as a crisis. And this is part of the urgency that we have to address the issue. And not knowing the extent of the problem is maybe something that we have difficulties in communicating. So people want to have big answers. They want to know how much plastic there is in the ocean. So big numbers with big global monitoring programs I think they're very useful in generating awareness, not necessarily in generating local solutions. But when someone says that, I don't know how many garbage trucks of litter enter the ocean every minute, that's something that people can be maybe scared of, and maybe that will gain some of attention. But then there's this whole area of like environmental psychology studies, which I'm not part of. I'm very parallel to this area. I haven't read much about it, which talk about how people react to these kinds of situations. So people might be in denial. Maybe they would respond better to more positive messages from the scientific community, and not necessarily us just talking about the doom and gloom. So this was something I saw recently in a conference as well, a lot about how we communicate and what are the best strategies for us to engage people and generate responses that we know are necessary. So if we but if we tell people about the science we're doing and what we're finding about marine litter, how much of that really develops a sense of citizenship towards the planet, and what makes people change their habits? This is a very difficult question, and if you talk to anyone who works with conservation, maybe they'll say that their problem is bigger than the problem that we're working with. So maybe someone who works with, I don't know, pesticides is going to be saying that their problem is more urgent than marine litter. Well, we might be saying the opposite. So we are under an environmental crisis in general. And I think people are kind of getting tired of the messages of the doom and gloom and not really sure where they can move forward. So like I said in the chat earlier, it's very difficult to find a balance between the bottom up and the top down approaches. So there's a lot of things that must come from the top that we already have the answers to in some ways, that we know are harmful things that should have been eradicated. So we have, I don't know, for example, pesticides again, that are prohibited in some parts of the world and not so in others. Why is that if we have evidence that they are harmful? So these are all very difficult questions and ways to approach the problem. So I really don't know how we can find the best practices in this situation, but it's definitely a difficult but necessary mission.
Yes, Carla, I think that was, very important point that you made. I wanted to clarify a little bit when I talked about the blind spot. The blind spot is a result basically of the normalcy bias that we all have, and it makes it very difficult for us to imagine that the future is totally different from the past. And Brown et al. Wrote a book about wicked problems in 2010, where they said we need transdisciplinary imagination to tackle wicked problems. And the question is, are scientists even able to use imagination to look at the problems, imagination in terms of what might happen, and not just in terms of what our models currently can predict, because our models have the same blind spots that we have. So models, I thought it was very interesting what Cathy O'Neill said. Basically, she said models are opinions embedded in mathematics. And they are the opinions of those who created the models. And so we have to understand that, with all of our biases, we create models that confirm our biases. And we have to really think about how can we create the knowledge that has a better perspective on the world than we currently have, and a better way of informing society about what needs to be considered. I was a little bit distracted from the chats.
And Peter, the British statistician George Box said all models are wrong, some are useful. So I think that any model that you come up with is wrong, but can give you some information. So don't believe that the model is the truth, 100% truth. If not, you're getting some other people saying that there are alternative truth. Not pointing to anyone in your country, but you see what I mean.
Renee, I think it was said a little bit earlier by somebody, I can't remember who said it. If models are opinions embedded in mathematics, we need to get different opinions.
Yep.
We have to have a lot of models.
Exactly, yeah.
That model the same aspect of the world, and then we can look at the opinions and see whether there is a consensus in one or the other direction between those opinions, right? But I think this idea of having transdisciplinary imagination is a very difficult one for us, but we need to have this if we want to really involve in participatory modeling. We have to be open for what comes from the stakeholders, and that's not easy for us as scientists. Well, who else wants to engage in this discussion? I think we gave Dan Martin a very difficult task to summarize all of this. But Dan, are you ready to say something, or do we want to give you a little bit more time?
It's up to you. I can summarize the presentation if you're ready for me to do that.
Yeah.
Yeah. Hopefully you can come up with any. I don't think we had any real recommendation, but maybe you can summarize it in a way that you actually talk about that. Jay, we can see you. You want to say something?
I just had a maybe not so simple question, Hans-Peter, since you always seem to raise very complex ones, which I enjoy. What you said, how does it relate to the discussions previously, and in particular to marine litter and addressing marine litter problems? Have I missed that?
Well, I think that marine litter is one of the Anthropocene risks, in my opinion. It's one of the risks that we have created, and it could turn into a catastrophic risk in terms of impacting the marine biosphere, impacting food security, impacting the health of people. So all of those questions that we discussed can be applied to marine debris, but they apply to our general situation. And I think that the one thing that I for example think we are overlooking is the risk that we are creating for future generations with building the urban coast the way we are building it right now. We are building the urban coast as if sea level would never rise. We build the urban coast as if hurricanes would not get stronger. We build everything based on the past. And we move a huge amount of people into the urban coast. And eventually, all of what is in the urban coast will be underwater, inundated, destroyed. Marine litter from hurricanes and tsunamis is increasing rapidly. If you had a major tsunami in 1700 or 1800, it wasn't really causing a lot of marine litter, but today a major tsunami is causing a huge amount of marine litter. The one in Japan in 2011 was estimated produced as much as marine litter as humanity does in 1 year. So this one tsunami brought all of this in the ocean. But we as scientists are focusing very strongly on measuring what goes into the ocean today without thinking about what are we doing to future generations. You know, in nuclear waste, we are thinking about creating a sign for nuclear waste that is readable in 10,000 years from now, because we take responsibility, ethical responsibility for our nuclear waste. Are we taking the same ethical responsibility for marine litter? Or are we just concerned about our beach to be clean right now and not thinking about what is our doing today causing to humanity in the future? So looking at the problem of marine litter, I think we need a little bit more imagination about what our activity today is doing to the future of humanity. I know I'm very engaged about this, but maybe that's because I deal with so many students who want to have a future and ask me what I would tell my 20-year-old self. And I tried to think about, if I were 20 years old today, what would I want to hear? And are we as scientists creating the knowledge that a 20-year-old today needs to know? Okay. Anybody else? Otherwise, I ask them to summarize, and then we have an early end.
I feel that, can I go?
Yeah,
Okay.
yeah.
I feel that it's very difficult to be creative and imagine things on very long terms if you are concerned with a deadline of something that's very close to you, like it's coming at you very fast right now. It's very difficult to imagine how it's going to be the problem with marine litter in, and I don't know, 100 years, if you are worried what is going to happen and you don't know really what's going to happen in 10, 20. Because yeah, like Carla said, it's very difficult to be creative under pressure and to be, but what we were talking a little bit earlier is that we also don't really have easy to read like warning lights in the ocean for marine litter or for anything for humans, because we are not we are not sea animals. We don't really, and sometimes it's very easy to ignore very clear warning signs for for humans. It's very easy for us to ignore them. And ideally, we could have like an ocean manual for marine litter. And a very, this is a very short-term idea. And this ocean manual that it's Carla's idea, I think it's brilliant, because we have some lights say, no, this is a red light for in the ocean. And communicate this idea, because it would be very, very necessary to point out, oh, people everywhere, this is a red light. We cannot keep doing this.
Yeah. You know what you just said is very, very it's very great for me to hear, because I think in 1999 or so I published a paper about that we need a cockpit for planet Earth. I said that we know a lot of things, what is happening, with our spaceship, but we don't know the levels that we have to actually change the trajectory, and we don't have red lights. And a few years ago, I talked about the lap sheet for planet Earth. We don't have the lap sheet where we can say, okay, we are out of the normal range, we are out of the normal range, we are out of the normal range. So what you are saying, you know, this is really, we have everything for our cars, but we don't have anything for our planet. Not really. And so maybe this is what we all need to think about. How can we populate a cockpit for the planet that then the people who make decisions about where we are taking the planet can actually use to get an information about whether there are red lights or yellow lights or green lights. I think that you are exactly pointing out of what is needed. So we are finally getting some discussion.
Yeah. You still have on your ship, you have the option to say, beam me up, Captain. That doesn't work always. The Star Trek stuff.
Yeah. Okay. Any last comment before Dan gives us a summary of this session? Dan?
Okay, so the first point that was discussed is what data and knowledge are needed. So the spectrum of features for a marine litter in the ocean could skew in a number of different directions based on certain natural drivers and pressures, as well as human responses and solutions to the problem. And the scientific community must make a decision whether to focus on avoiding type 1 errors to avoid alarmism, or focus on avoiding type 2 errors and avoid overlooking warning signs. Currently, plastic production produces as much CO2 emissions as 40 million cars and impacts the lives of 500 billion to 1 trillion people to be born in the next 5,000 years, in many cases violating their rights before they're even born. Interventions must be developed to guide the system towards a desirable future and to devise and achieve reasonable and effective sustainability goals. For these interventions to be well informed and effective, there must be a good understanding of adaptation science, developing and validating transformation knowledge. We must have a good understanding of what we don't know before we can try to learn it. Currently, there is no consistent method for conducting gap analyses that is universally accepted. The second point that was discussed is the co-creation of research agendas and knowledge. And a primary goal for this research should be to create knowledge that can be used by societal agents to produce effective change. And knowledge can be defined as information that is justified, true, and believed. Belief requires trust, and participatory creation of knowledge with the community creates trust and knowledge usage. And there's a spectrum of methods for engaging societal agents that range from maintaining a diversity of views to converging to a shared viewpoint, and from sharing existing knowledge to reacting to new scenarios. And the third point that was discussed was the co-usage of knowledge. And integrating science into society and improving scientific literacy is crucial for the developed interventions to be successful. One way this can be achieved is through developing pathways through which the gap between experts and the general public can be closed.
Okay, thank you. That I think summarizes a little bit what we have been talking about. I would like to invite everybody who has other notes that we should include in what we send to Renee and Arthur, then send it to me in the next 2 or 3 hours, and then Renee, we will send something to you, a summary of what we have, what comes out of this session. And you may want to add your own.
Yeah, I took notes as well, so that would be great.
Okay, then I think we have come to a relatively early end. I've just sent my email address to everybody so that if you want to send something to me, please do so. And then Dan and I will combine it and send it to you, Renee.
Yeah. And Arthur as well.
Okay.
And we have the recording. So if you, Arthur is, when we end, Arthur will download, well, the system will download the recording to the computer, and then you can access it. Well, Arthur will tell you where to do, where to get it.
Are you also making the chat available?
I think it's embedded in a recording.
It normally is saved as a separate file, and it would have to be made available.
Okay, what you can do is just you copy the complete chat, just you know, Control A or something like that, and Control V somewhere. So,
so if I can jump in, I'll take care of that. And in the session folder on the Google Sheet folder, there'll be a transcript of the chat available together with the link to the recording video.
Because the copying from the screen doesn't really work. Okay, well, thank you, everybody. I think it was a very lively discussion. I thought we would use the whole 2 hours, but I think there's no need to prolong this. I'm glad that so many of you see the need to acknowledge a little bit better the urgency that we have, and that we have a task as scientists, and maybe even an ethical responsibility to inform society about the yellow lights that we might see, or even the red lights we might see, a little bit more clearly than we are currently doing. Okay, thank you very much.
thank you.
I'll leave now.
Renee, could you stay on for just a minute?
Yeah.
Arthur, do you want to stay on?